Bartimaeus, the one who eagerly followed Jesus on the way. The way. Where was the way? The way was to Jerusalem. The way was to a sentencing of death based on a vote by the crowd. Crucify him. Crucify him. The way was to suffering, a lashing by a whip laced with lead balls, carrying his cross to a hill called Calvary, aided by Simon of Cyrene. The way to a death on a cross. The way to his burial, and an empty tomb the morning after resurrection. The way to ascension into heaven. That's the way. Now, the Gospel of Mark has 16 chapters. And I find it interesting that Mark has 14, by my count, healing stories through to the end of the 10th chapter, and the story of Bartimaeus being the final one. And of those healing stories, 3 involve many healings, and the others just one healing. Now, I don't mean there were other miracles in the Gospel of Mark, quite a number of them, but I'm talking about healing of human being stories. But of all the healing stories, Mark saves the healing of Bartimaeus for the last. It's the very last one. And I had to ask myself, why? Why is this one the last one for Mark? Well, if you look at each of the stories, you find things about Bartimaeus' story that are more profound and more important for Mark's community, his church community, to know about the meaning of faith and discipleship, not just about the miracle of healing itself. That's the setting. It's about the meaning of faith and discipleship. Bartimaeus' story is a model of coming to Jesus, of obstacles coming to Jesus, of faith in Jesus to heal and transform one's life, one's direction and purpose, of an eager response to Jesus' healing touch, and of following Jesus after being healed. In those other stories, the people are healed, but you don't see them following afterwards. But Bartimaeus, you do. These elements are all there in this one story, but you will find not all of these elements are in the other healing stories, particularly the element where Bartimaeus follows Jesus on the way. And now we all know what the way is, where it is, where it's going. Bartimaeus is a model for faith and discipleship. In the final verse, Jesus names faith as what impels and heals Bartimaeus. Go, your faith has made you well. Now, the rest of the story shows us what that faith is. Bartimaeus' faith is not about reciting the correct confession or subscribing to certain dogmas and creedal formulas or the 613 commandments Jews were expected to follow. Yeah, you heard me right, 613. It is his profound conviction that Jesus can and will rescue him from his blindness, from his outcast place in society, from his poverty, from his begging every day to stay alive. Bartimaeus knows who Jesus is. We don't know how he found out, but he knows he is able to show mercy and to heal is this man that Bartimaeus is seeking. He knows that. Now, as we heard from the reading of the gospel story and saw in the puppet show, Bartimaeus faced some serious obstacles. Serious obstacles. That crowd did not care about him, did not respect him, did not want him getting in the way. We're busy. Get away. That's your place in society anyway. The crowd was thick, and when Bartimaeus tried to get Jesus' attention, people in the crowd ordered him, "Be quiet." But that wouldn't stop Bartimaeus. And that's an important point for us to notice in that story. It didn't stop him. It made him yell even louder. He was persistent. He wanted to get to Jesus. Nothing was going to stop him, and he finally got Jesus' attention. So Jesus calls him over and asks him what he wants him to do for him. "Let me see again," Bartimaeus said. Well, Mark's point here is, this is my opinion, this is my interpretation, I think. His point here is that faith does not always come easily for some and must surmount obstacles to obtain what it seeks. And Jesus wants you, he wants me to tell him specifically what we want him to do for us. Jesus is measuring the depth of our faith in him because that is important to the healing process. Faith is important to the healing process. And maintaining our faith isn't always that easy. There are so many obstacles in our world and daily lives that pull us away from God and from church, that weaken our faith and strength to follow Jesus daily. We get angry with God because things didn't turn out the way we wanted. We get angry with our local church where we're a member, and we leave, and then we end up staying away from church altogether. Our kids, we've raised them up in the church, then they go off to college, then that's it for us. So many of the parents, when their kids go off to college, they leave church. And then all these community activities. When Sunita and I came to Northern Virginia in 1985, we put Adam into the soccer league. And the first year, there were no soccer games in Fairfax County on Sunday at that time. But then it only took a year. Soccer, baseball, whatever. And I was coaching at the time, so I remember rushing out of church to get to that game, which was like at 12:30 or 1 o'clock, because I was helping to coach. Now the games are like at 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock on Sundays. Even our kids are not coming to church because of it. We have many obstacles that get in the way of our faith. And Bartimaeus, he was persistent and he followed Jesus on the way. His faith was strong and he overcame the obstacle of those people who had no respect for him. I want to share with you a story, the context of which, it's not from this book, it's real life. But it's in an area where my first parish as the senior pastor was down in Franklin County, Virginia. Maybe you've heard of it. Ferrum College is down there. It was at one time anyway, I won't mention that. Okay, my first week there, I have a funeral. First week. It's my third year in the ministry. I had done a couple of funerals in my first parish as an associate, but this was the first week. So I go over to the family's home. The man's name is Lum Gusler. So we sit down and we start preparing for the funeral. And I have to find out who this man is. I need some examples, some characteristics, because they're not going to get up and say anything. So what you have to understand is, I'm going to tell you a story you're probably not going to believe, and if I had heard it, I wouldn't have believed it either. But the context is found in this book, The Man Who Moved a Mountain, about a minister who established the Presbyterian Church in Franklin County and another county on top of the Blue Ridge there, mountains. And there, if you go down there, there are some of those, there's gray stone churches. And this young man grew up there. The Presbyterians found him because they wanted a missionary there. Now, Lum grew up at a time when people were not very nice to each other, not very civil. They were very independent, Scotch-Irish. They had their own little homesteads down in those hollows. Okay, one of the main areas where people lived was called Shooting Creek. And it's not about the creek shooting. It's about guns. I'd go into people's homes, see pictures, and the men always had their guns. If somebody got angry at you, they'd shoot you. There were shootings at churches and whatnot. A preacher at Maple Grove came to do a revival one night, and he spoke against moonshine and alcohol. Well, there was somebody waiting outside with a gun to shoot him. Okay, so we're sitting there, and I'm taking notes about Lum Gusler. Now, when I did prepare for funerals for these people, they always wanted you to know that their loved one was active in church. Okay? And that was important to them if the person was. If they weren't, they don't bring that up. So they're talking about Lum. Now, the people in that county at the time did not like the church. This poor minister, he would be having services and people would be throwing stones on the roof, trying to disrupt the service any way they could. Okay? So this man had to grow up in this environment, and his friends, none were Christians. Okay? The story gets even better. His daughter and husband were going to church. So they finally convinced him to go to a revival. That's something I had to get used to, revivals. Wasn't used to that when I didn't grow up with revivals, and I wasn't used to having to have them. So on about the third night, he liked what he was hearing, and he wanted to give his life to Jesus. So he let his family know that, and it got to some other members of the church, of his family. So when they heard that he was going to give his life to Christ, they showed up. Not just his daughter and son-in-law, but those other family members showed up. And they all sat in the pew. So when Lum got up for the altar call to go up to give his life to Jesus, they wouldn't let him go. They would not let him go to the altar. All right? He goes back the next night. He has a plan. He made sure they sat close to the front, to the altar, probably about where Chapman's sitting, is my guess. So when it came time for the altar, and these family members were there, they told me that Lum got up on the pew, stepped across to the front pew, and walked up to the altar and gave his life to Jesus. There you have it. Obstacles. Crawled across the pew to give his life to Jesus and became active in the church for the rest of his life. Bartimaeus, Lum Gusler, they knew what they wanted, and they persisted. They wanted Jesus. They wanted new life. They wanted transformation. They wanted their blindness lifted. They wanted salvation. They wanted their eyes open to new spiritual, social realities made possible when God reigns in our lives. And each one of them got it. Now, the most important lesson in this story for Mark, I believe, is not in the healing of Bartimaeus. No, it's not. It's in the last 10 words of that story. He regained his sight, and he followed him on the way. Bartimaeus begins the story on the side of the road in rags, begging. He ends the story as a follower of Jesus. And keep in mind, Jesus is passing through Jericho on his way to Jerusalem. His years of ministry in the Galilee are over. And now he is on the way to Jerusalem, to suffering, to the cross, and finally to resurrection and ascension. And Bartimaeus eagerly followed Jesus on the way to Jerusalem. And we too, as disciples of Jesus, are called to eagerly follow Jesus on the way to Jerusalem, to suffering, to resurrection living here on earth now, and ascension into heaven at the end of our time here on earth. That's the story. Bartimaeus was healed. His sight was restored. But more importantly than his healing is what came after. This is a witness to what faith and discipleship are all about for Mark. This is what he wanted his religious community to know. What do you want Jesus to do for you right now, today? And what does Jesus want you to do for him right now, today, this week? In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.